Hello friends and welcome, I'm V8 Adam. In today's video I'll be showing you the replacement of the fuel sender on my 1972 Buick Riviera. This job was actually completed by the fantastic guys at Namco in Farnborough, as unfortunately I don't have the facilities to actually drop the tank out on my car. Now this video is going to be a little bit different as unfortunately I don't actually have any footage of the tank coming out. I've only got it going back in. I've got some pictures of the tank out, so I just wanted to share with you what I had and make sure that you have an idea of how this tank comes out and sort of goes in. So when I purchased a Riviera, the fuel gauge wasn't working. It was actually stuck on full. It's quite a common problem with these old classics. I wanted to get the gauge working, so I did some research. I watched some excellent videos, which are all in the description below. And this also tells you how the fuel sender and the gauge actually work. So I really recommend that you check those out. So by following the advice in this video, I knew that the sender was almost certainly faulty. I purchased a new one, which was a Spectra Premium FG106A. Link is in the description below. This is what it looks like. And something important to note as well is that ethanol can really eat through parts of the sender as well as some other parts of your old classic, especially any solder joints. Now here in the UK, Esso Supreme Plus fuel doesn't actually contain any ethanol, with the exception of Devon, Cornwall, Teesside and Scotland. So if you're in those areas, unfortunately, it does contain ethanol. But if you're not, which is a lot of the UK, then that is the fuel to go for if you've got a classic, because there's actually no ethanol content in that at all. You may see on the fuel filler that it has an E5, which may make you think that it has 5% ethanol content, but actually that's just a sort of a mandated sign that they have to put on there to say that the fuel contains up to 5% ethanol. In this case, it actually contains 0%. So I definitely recommend using that fuel if you've got an old classic. It's more expensive, but it's a hell of a lot cheaper than dropping your fuel tank out after only about a year because your sender's been eaten. So let's take a look at some of the pictures here of what the fuel tank actually looks like. Unusually on the 1971-1972 Rivieras, not on the 1973, it's just 71-72, the fuel filler is not actually central on the tank. So it's off to one side. So you might notice if you look at a 71 and 72 Riviera, the license plate, because that's what the fuel filler is behind, is actually off to one side on the 71-72, whereas it's in the middle on the 73, because they kind of moved to a more standardized fuel tank with it in the middle. The problem with this is because it's a more unusual filler, it makes replacing a tank very, very difficult, right? Because it's very hard to find a tank with a filler in this location. The general advice, if you do need to replace one of these tanks, is to actually go for a centrally mounted filler tank, like for example the 73 Riviera tank, and actually just move the filler. That is the easiest thing to do. You can do that yourself if you're used to metal work. You cut the filler off, weld in a patch and put it on the other side, or you'd need to get a specialist to do this if you're not used to doing that. The only other option that I could see is to completely custom fabricate a tank from scratch, which is another option as well, if you need to get a new tank completely. Now in my case, I was really fortunate and my tank was actually in great condition, as you can see from these photos. As you can see, there's very little degradation, and I was actually really surprised that it was in such great shape, to be honest. I mean, I've seen some pictures of the inside of these tanks after about 50 years, and they've got rust and loose particles and all sorts of junk comes out of them when they do flushes on them. So I was really, really happy that this was in such great condition. On the outside, it was in really good condition as well. It was just a little bit of light rust, and some aqua steel rust converter really took care of that, because that's actually a converter and an inhibitor, unlike something like pour, which just goes over the rust, but the rust still sits underneath. So looking at some more pictures here, you can see where the fuel sender is actually located here. There's two hoses going to it, as well as the ground connector that you can see here, and the electrical point for the cable that provides the resistance reading. Looking at the picture, you can see some other fuel lines here from the tank, which then go off to the engine bay. Let's take a little look now at the video of the boys putting the tank back in, and this will give you a really good idea of how the tank's positioned and held in. When taking the tank out or putting it back in, the most important thing is to be really careful of that filler neck. It's extremely delicate, and apparently it's only kind of soldered on, and it can snap really easily, especially because it's on the side. When you're bringing it out, it doesn't really come out gracefully as it would in the middle. It doesn't just drop out because it's sort of angled to that side. So that is the most important thing to be conscious of when you're taking this tank out. And you basically need to make sure that it's supported really well, and you need to drop it out very slowly and put it back in slowly. You can actually see the guys here using a trolley jack in a bit and using some wood to support it. And if you've got a lift like this, then that is ideal, and that will allow you to get right under the car and sort of control this in a very good way. If you don't have the luxury of a lift like me, then if you don't want to take it in to do professionally and you want to do it yourself, I would probably recommend putting the car up very securely on axle stands, getting the car up high, as you know, sort of to a reasonable height. My axle stands, for example, extend to 600 millimeters, and getting a jack or a couple of jacks, some wood underneath that tank, and making sure it's really well supported before you take it out. And of course, make sure that it's drained of fuel as well, because you don't want, first of all, loads of fuel sloshing around. It's going to be dangerous, but also you don't want the extra weight in there as well. So drain as much fuel out as you can just by driving the car around, but also siphon some out as well using a siphon kit. That would be my recommendation. And you can see that there's these straps here which hold the tank into position, and you can see at this point the guys have actually stopped putting the tank in so that they can reconnect the sender wire. So make sure you don't forget that step, because the last thing you want to do is really carefully lift the tank in, get it all secured, and then realise you haven't connected the cable, because you won't be able to get your hand up once the tank is back in. This is another reason that really this is so much easier on a lift, and this is going to be a very tricky job to do if you don't have an access to a proper lift to get the car up off of the ground to a nice height. So like the filler neck as well, it's really important when you're dropping the tank out to make sure that you disconnect this cable as you're dropping the tank out, because if you just drop the tank out too quickly, then you'll snap this cable and then you'll be in real trouble. So you can even see how fiddly this was for the pros, you know, lifting up there and trying to get that connection on. And the key is to really just take your time, and you can also see how careful they've been with the filler neck to make sure that it's aligned and make sure it's going back in nicely. So I'm just going to go quiet for a minute while we finish watching the guys put this in, and then I'll come back in once they've managed to secure these cables. So now the tank's actually back in place, the straps can be bolted up, and then the fuel lines attached. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any footage of the fuel lines, but they were very difficult to get back on. They had to get the owner of the shop in the end to put them back on because they were so stiff. and he used a small amount of silicone grease just to help get that hose back on. Just be careful with using any grease, because he told me afterwards, he said it's okay to use a tiny little bit to just help it slip on. But the important thing you need to remember is if you're using something like silicone grease, which is fuel resistant, the grease will stay on, and so that will lubricate the pipe forever. Basically, it will lubricate it the whole time it's on there. Now, it's okay if you've used a small amount, but don't use too much, because otherwise the line will essentially always be loose, and you don't want anything like that. So it's also worth replacing any hoses while you're under here and doing this job, because the hoses are probably going to be degraded over time, and it just makes sense while you're down there taking all of these lines off. A good tip that I got from a couple of people on the forum as well is when you're taking things off, like a fuel line, this goes for heater lines or coolant lines or anything like that in your engine bay as well. If they're very old, they can actually bond to the connector and really be very, very difficult to get off. They're very, very stiff to get off, and in some cases they're practically, you know, kind of part of the metal. Don't get wrapped up in trying to pull them off and trying to pull those hoses off and use tools to pry them off, because all you're going to do is risk bending the metal underneath, and that is the bit that you need to retain. If you think about it, the hose you don't care about. You're going to be throwing that away. You're going to be replacing that. So don't try and pull it off. Don't try and work it off. Don't try and pry it off. Just cut it off. Just use a sharp blade and just cut down the length of the hose, peel it back. Even cut it in a few places if you need to, and peel it back. Be careful when you're cutting, obviously. Make sure that the fuel's drained. Make sure there's not going to be too much fuel in the lines or anything like that, and make sure you're doing it safely and not pushing too hard on the metal underneath, because you don't want to damage it. But just cut those lines off and peel them off. I found that an incredible tip when I was doing my coolant flush, because even on the lower hose, when I cut it off and peeled it off, it was so stuck on even when I'd cut it and I'd peeled it off. So that's a really good tip for getting those lines off. The other thing that I'd recommend is what I mentioned earlier, which is Aquasteel Rust Converter. It's a product made here in the UK. It's absolutely brilliant, because what it actually does is it undergoes a chemical reaction on the rust and actually converts it to an inert form, and that means that the rust will not only stop dead in its tracks, but the rust that you've converted is no longer rust. It's no longer corrosive. It's a much stronger form, a chemical form. So it's much better than something like POR that I mentioned earlier, which literally stands for paint over rust, because all that POR does, yes, it will kind of stop any new rust forming, but the rust underneath the paint will still be there, and it will still be rust. And if there's any moisture trapped in there, or any moisture gets in there through condensation or anything like that, then it will still continue to react underneath the POR. Here are some shots underneath the back of the Buick from when I used Aquasteel on some of the cross members, and you can see here on the right hand side, before I used it, there was a lot of surface rust and some of the previous protection had flaked off. And then on the left hand side here, where I'd used some of the Aquasteel, you can see how much of a massive difference it's made and how much better it's made that underside look. So hopefully you found that video really useful and interesting to see how it goes out, how it goes in. And hopefully there's a few other little useful tips in there, and the videos which I've put in the description will hopefully help you further with how a fuel gauge actually works and how the sender works if you're interested in knowing more about that. So, as always, please like and subscribe if you like this video, and until next time, this is VA Adam signing off.